Well, Rania, we want to just keep going here and turn to, another just completely ridiculous situation we're all living in. I guess we're now in the post-Roe world, and I think the aftermath and the ripple effects of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey still with us. And we are happy to have with us, to continue the conversation, Claudia De La Cruz, who's the co-executive director of the People's Forum, a popular educator, and many other fantastic things. Claudia, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be on the freedom side with Rania and Eugene.
Well, it's the right side of things, that's for sure.
Or the left
Obviously,
side of
we've
things.
seen the decision, a number of days of protests. There's about 150, 250 people today in front of the Supreme Court getting arrested, blocking streets. And so obviously the rise of civil disobedience in response to this. We've seen President Biden say, I guess, that he's in favor now of having a filibuster carve out, but under certain circumstances. So, I mean, in terms of where we are now, Claudia, I don't know if this is a question or just throwing this out there. I mean, where do you see this moment and what is to be done, if you will?
I mean, I think it's extremely important to acknowledge that we're living in really explosive times in which there are numerous struggles taking place. And the ruling by the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade is one of a huge blow in a list of criminal attacks against the poor and working class in this country. Historically, in moments of multi-layered crisis, like the one that we're experiencing with housing, with homelessness, unemployment, the rising of inequality, inflation, the blatant disregard for human life by the government is of particular historical significance that the most marginalized, meaning women and LGBTQ plus communities, are the ones that are attacked the harder. What are we experiencing? What we're experiencing with this Supreme Court ruling is a rolling back of civil and human rights that have been won on the streets with struggle by communities that have been protected because they've been under attack since the moment they were given, since the moment we won them. And so we've been protecting these rights for decades. And this is a frontal declaration of war against the working class and poor people in this country. To think that this is only an issue of women, to think that this is only an issue of people who are biologically able to give birth, is to miss the mark. It is important for us to understand that this ruling is claiming further control over our lives, over our bodies, and it's a clear intent to control how and when we reproduce. And this is ridiculous, and it's immoral, and it's criminal. And I speak this not only as a political educator, as an organizer, but I also speak this as a religious leader, as a faith leader. This is completely inhumane. It's appalling. It's outrageous to think that institutions like the Supreme Court have the power to take these actions, that each of these people who represent the elite and their interests have life tenure to play with our lives. The Supreme Court needs to be abolished. Like, it needs to.
And I mean,
I think
that.
Rania, good. No,
Well, no.
there's another
I
one.
didn't mean to interrupt your thought. I think it's like what you're saying is so important and it's so true. And then we see the response to it. And the response has been so muted from the Democratic leadership. Nancy Pelosi read a poem by an Israeli poet of all poems. Like I've seen a few different interpretations of what that poem is about, but it's not good. It's not a good thing. And then, Joe Biden has been kind of tweeting, we're going to do something. And now he's saying maybe there's room about the filibuster, but it's not quite clear what can be done because Democratic leadership is making it seem like their hands are tied and they can't do anything, but that's not quite true. What can be done?
No.
And what has been the response as you've seen it from Democratic leadership? And what does that mean about that party? A lot of questions.
No. It's on the mark, Rania, and I think it's on the mark because what they're doing is on brand. It is exactly what they have always done, and it's important for us to understand that, and as a people, we need to start acting differently and towards something that is divorced from the Democratic Party, from the Republican Party, that is a movement that is politically independent from parties that are there to serve the interest of the elite. I mean, it is disgusting, but it is a pattern in history that the Democratic Party will work against working class interests, working class values, and the lives of the majority of the people. It is not about saving lives. It is not about, saving children. Biden has the power to make an executive order, and he's not doing it because it's too polarizing, because the Democratic Party has always ceded to the Republican Party. They've always played the part that they're meant to play within the capitalist system. It is a game where every 4 years they decide who will continue to advance the interest of the ruling class. And it doesn't matter whether it is the Republican Party or it is the Democratic Party. Like, they really don't have the interest of the working class at heart. It's important for us to understand that this sets a precedent. That it cannot be niched as an issue of women. It cannot be niched as an issue of people who just simply have the biological capacity to give birth. Because this sets a precedent for the rolling back of many other rights that have been gained by struggles of the LGBTQ plus community, workers' rights. I mean, just today I read that there were rulings around climate change. Like, they are really looking one after the other to be able to advance the agenda of a ruling class that is there for profit and not for people. I mean, in the United States, women are 14 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. If we look at the South and we look at Mississippi, a Black woman is 118 times more likely to die by carrying a pregnancy to term than by having an abortion. And if they really cared about women, about children, especially those in communities that have been historically marginalized, that the Black and brown communities, we would have free childcare. We would have free access to education. We would have affordable and adequate housing. We wouldn't be experiencing shortages like we have of baby formula. In the wealthiest country in the world, they would be putting funds for social progress and not for war, right? So with this ruling again, I think looking at what the people's response has been very reflective of the times. It's not only, again, about abortions, it's about everything else that has been taken away. It gives me the sense of the rebellions of 2020 with George Floyd, where there was a convergence of things. And what we cannot allow to do was what we did during the 2020 rebellions, which was leave the streets. We cannot leave the streets. We have to continue to take the streets. We need to deepen our political education processes in our communities. We need to make it known that the issue around abortion rights is an issue of human rights and is interconnected with so many other struggles. And so we need to build broader coalitions that connect all these things that are about advancing our livelihood and our right to a dignified life. And so what is there to do? We need to continue to agitate. We need to continue to educate. We need to continue to organize. And we definitely need to do things differently. We cannot give our lives onto politicians that are not there to protect it, they're not there to care for it, and they're not there to advance what we really need. And so, if you tell me we need a socialist revolution, that's what I think. And we need to start working towards advancing that. We need to start working towards advancing what that would look like, because it's not that we can't. We definitely have everything viable to make a socialist revolution in this country. We do. What we need is to stop conceding and stop giving our power as the masses to politicians that are part of the Democratic Party, that are part of the Republican Party, and who do not care about us. We need to build a politically independent movement that puts the needs of the people front and center.
No, I think the point is Very well taken point, and I think it speaks to the sort of broader issue of staying in the streets and the role of political action. Marta Honecker said once that if you want to build political power, you have to first build social power. And I feel in the context of building up a movement that in many ways had become atrophied, I think there's some level of complacency perhaps, given the momentousness. I mean, this is, like Brown versus the Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, these foundational cases. And I say all that to say, to speak to the point that you made about sort of the moral nature of this case. And, I didn't sort of idly mention the people who got arrested today over by the Supreme Court because, you think about the abolitionist movement, what made it possible for, at least an anti-slavery, if not an abolitionist party, to come to power in 1860, this powerful movement of civil disobedience against slavery, against the Fugitive Slave Act, the so-called higher law concept that it didn't really matter what the law said because slavery was wrong and people should stand up to it. Obviously, the civil rights movement, almost everything done by the civil rights movement in the South was technically illegal, but the sort of gap between morality and legality was exactly what moved the country to change. And I wonder if it feels like a similar moment to you here, Claudia.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the legal system is tyranny. It's criminal at this moment. It is criminal. Like, it is an outright attack towards working class, poor women. And I say that specifically because the elites have always found ways to do what they need to do for themselves. And the systems in place have always allowed for them to do it, whether it's legal or not. And so for us, it's a matter of life and death, and is an orchestrated systemic attack against our lives in every dimension, in every way. And so we need to fight for our lives. And that might imply doing things that go against the very system that oppresses us. I mean, it's not might, it will imply us doing it. It will imply us doing it. And so unless we have the capacity, again, to organize in masses, unless we have the capacity to deeply shift the culture and the understanding around these issues and what our power is, we will not advance. I mean, there's a saying, we only gain what we're organized to take. We only gain what we're organized to take. If we don't organize to take it, they will not give it to us because it's not in their interest to give it to us.
So what you're saying is that giving $15 to Beto O'Rourke is not the way.
Robert Francis O'Rourke, thank you.
Excuse me.
Just not going to let his little brown face act go on for another electoral cycle.
But no, I mean, I think it's so important what you're saying too, because it's not, of course, like you're saying, it's not just about abortion rights. It's not just about reproductive rights. I mean, we saw in that opinion by Clarence Thomas, like they want to take it all. They want to strip it all away. And I know there is another ruling that came through, or I'm not sure. I haven't read all the rulings, but there was talk about voting rights being stripped away, or more the potential for more voting rights being stripped away because of a ruling. And of course, we saw the opinion about contraception and re-examining, gay marriage. And it's just all of these very regressive things that are going to make it much more difficult for the Pentagon to wave like rainbow flags, like they have been doing all week, at least in the part of the world I'm in. But that said, I think it's a good, point you're making. So what can people do? Because I think a lot of times, especially with the coverage, like you're mentioning people on the streets, the media is kind of giving some coverage to that, but it's not giving, I think, enough coverage to that because, I'm not in the U.S. right now. And if I'm looking at the New York Times, I don't know that people are really in the streets over this. So for a lot of people who are watching and might feel helpless and sort of like hopeless, what can they be doing in this moment to push back against this stuff?
I mean, again, I think that political organization is key. I think one of the ways in which the right and the elite in this country has been allowed to advance is by placing our faith, the masses placing their faith on that political instrument, which is not a political instrument of the working class. Biden talked about, our very privacy is on the ballot. Abortion rights is on the ballot, and it becomes this political charade, this game where people actually do believe that if they vote for the lesser of two evils, life will improve. And, the reality is that that's not the case.
Right.
And so when we're talking about building political organization, we're talking about building the power of the masses and the organizations that represent that. Whether it is a mass organization doing the work of educating in communities, whether it is a political organization advancing a political platform that really does center the people's needs, that's what we need to be building. I think protests are necessary. Taking the streets is necessary. It does something to the collective morale of the people to come together to show our discontent collectively, and also give us power and energy and enthusiasm to be able to do the day-to-day work that needs to happen. So the protest is not the last thing. It's actually a way of kind of raising the mystica, the morale of the struggle, to then continue to do the work that needs to be done on the day-to-day basis. And one individual cannot do that by themselves. We need to do it within organizations. And no one organization alone can advance it. That's why coalition building is necessary. And when we're talking about sectoral organizing of coalitions, is understanding the intersectionality of all these different issues that are an issue, again, of class war. Is a war of the elite against the working class. And so if we're able to be in spaces like that, deepen our analysis, there is a better possibility for us to develop a more complete strategy that allows us to be a political force in this country, to be a social force in this country, because we are the majority. And so I can't give, the 7 things to do when abortion, that's not how we operate. But but what I can say is that
If only it was that easy.
Miss this moment, if we miss this moment, which is a moment where a lot of young people are becoming politicized by the inactivity of the government. And when I say we, I mean the left. I mean the folks that are trying to move forward a socialist agenda, the folks that are on the progressive side. If we miss this moment of being the ones that orient what is happening in the streets, organizing it in a way that it becomes systematic, in a way that it becomes planned and intentionally politically, then we have ourselves ceded to the bourgeoisie. We have given the power to the bourgeoisie, and we can't continue to do that.
Let me just ask you this, a slight digression, but I think going back to, sort of a point we were touching on earlier, and, in the cultural terrain, I don't even like to call it this, the so-called pro-life movement. I mean, so much of their rhetoric is wrapped in this sort of Christian charity sort of reality, and what I personally would say is the weaponization of religious beliefs in order to promote something that is, about something else. But I was hoping you could talk about that, because that does seem like a big piece of this, because the way it's sort of presented, and I think to some degree why this so-called pro-life movement has to some degree been able to gain traction, is this sort of, the negative pall they were able to place around abortion. Like, even for people who were for it, it was kind of like, well, it seems like it probably is bad, even if I think it's between a woman and her doctor, or it is bad, but I don't think the government should regulate it. Like, in some ways, even though majority of people have not agreed with these extreme views, they have sort of, in a cultural sense, people point this out all the time, for instance, how there's almost never any abortions in movies or TV, so-called liberal Hollywood. And sort of, anyway, this sort of battle of ideas, cultural aspect of this seems important in terms of how we reach people.
Mm-hmm. It's extremely important. It's extremely important. And I'll say, again, as a person of faith, as someone who has been within the institution of the church with the big C, that there's a huge responsibility to acknowledge that when we're talking about the church with the big C, the institution of the church, it comes from imperial and imperialist ideologies. And it's been a tool to be able to justify the abuses of power from empire and the states, capitalist states. And so when we think about the rules that come out of this institution of the church, they're not divorced from the state at all. Even though, we want to talk about the separation of church and state, that's complete nonsense. There's nothing more political than the church. And we could have that show another time, but there is nothing more political than the church. And so when we're talking about these narratives about how wrong it is for a woman to have autonomy over her body, we have to also think about what capitalism meant, what slavery meant, and what reproduction meant to the capitalist system, the reproduction of human beings in relationship to labor. And so we cannot disconnect ourselves and think that, this is a matter of saving lives and it's a matter of that works in the moral realm, because it's not about that at all. It's about control. It's about giving control to the state and being justified somehow by a religious institution that wants us to be pacified, that wants us to be okay with it, even though we know it's not okay. I mean, when we talk about, there's a really dope documentary that came out called The Janes. Yeah. And it talks about, the way in which women during the 70s took on control and created community strategies around the issue of abortion, and actually were a pathway for abortion to happen. And it was obviously criminalized, like it's attempting to be criminalized now. And that seems to me like something Jesus would have done, at least the Jesus I know. He would have found a way where there was no way to make sure that lives were protected, that people lived in a dignified way. And if the church isn't promoting that, they're promoting the opposite, which means that the church becomes the enemy of the people. And in this case, you have multi-billion-dollar paid churches like the Olsen clan that are being paid by the Republicans, and that go out there and do campaigning, and you tell me what's godly about that. And so we need to be able to also analyze that narrative about the separation of state and church is plain BS, and that there's a narrative that progressive faith leaders need to counteract very firmly. Very firmly. This has nothing to do with divinity, and it has nothing to do with morality, and it has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with the same system that has displaced millions and millions of people from their land, from a system that has built colonies and processes of colonization, that has built slavery and the exploitation of millions and millions of people, billions, and is like responsible for genocide. Like that is what the church is and has been. And if we don't come to terms with that, then we are part of the enemies of the people. And we don't want to be that, because that's not what Jesus taught us. I mean, my Jesus is a Palestinian.
Right on.
Well, all very well said. All very well said. I
got me fired up.
That. Yeah, no, that's the line has been drawn underneath.
So we needed to hear.
Yeah. If you're ever in New York City and wondering why, you should come by the People's Forum, because that's the energy that percolates in the People's Forum. But Claudia De La Cruz, theologian, community organizer, popular educator, and co-executive director of the People's Forum, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.